to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we hear from Dr. Christopher Kolenda, a retired U.S. Army colonel and author most recently of Zero-Sum Victory, What We Get Wrong About War. Kolenda discusses, drawing from his experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, why it is that the United States has so often wound up in a quagmire when it seeks to achieve important interventions around the world in support of human rights and democratic governance, as well as in support of other strategic goals. Kolenda argues that the United States is not adept at identifying outcomes other than decisive victory and cannot identify measures by which to assess how well they are doing at anything other than achieving a decisive victory. Secondly, he argues the U.S. is slow to adapt when strategies are not working. And finally, when the U.S. chooses to withdraw, bargaining asymmetries resulting from the U.S.'s strategy result in suboptimal solutions. Kolenda's book is out recently, and he spoke at the University of Texas, Austin. He's introduced by Paul Edgar, Deputy Director of the Clements Center. Let's listen in.
My name's Paul Edgar. For those of you that I don't already know, I'm the Associate Director for the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas. And it really is my pleasure today to introduce to you someone who I have been keeping track of for almost 20 years. He preceded me in the military by a few years and did important work that for those of us doing, at least initially, the tactical work in Afghanistan, Iraq, elsewhere, and then later strategic level work. This gentleman was a trailblazer for us. So, a retired U.S. Army Colonel Chris Kolenda. He's the founder, since retiring from the Army, of Strategic Leaders Academy, which helps people lead and build teams to propel their businesses and organizations forward. He's had tremendous success in this work, increasing the value of companies and organizations by several $1 million. He's earned his doctorate at the War Studies Department at King's College London, which is one of the institutions that we are closely associated with, especially with our Maymester program for undergraduate students. In 2007 and 2008, he led a battalion of paratroopers, about 800 soldiers, in northeastern Afghanistan. And I like to say, some of you have heard me say this, I like to say that the military often does blue-collar diplomacy. It's not necessarily what they're trained to do. It's not what we necessarily intend for them to do, although sometimes it is the case that we send soldiers to do blue-collar diplomacy. But that's what he did in northeastern Afghanistan. And his unit was possibly the only organization that convinced a substantial group of insurgents to switch sides. He served as an advisor, so after his tactical level work, he served as an advisor to 3 4-star generals in Afghanistan and 2 secretaries of defense. From 2010 to 2013, he was the Secretary of Defense's personal representative in our early talks with the Taliban. He's the author of 3 books, Leadership, The Warrior's Art, which is about 20 years old, but has just been revised and updated. There's a new edition here. The Counterinsurgency Challenge. And then the bulk of today's talk will come from his newest book, which is barely 30 days out, Zero-Sum Victory, What We're Getting Wrong About War. And again, that came out just over a month ago. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Chris Kolenda. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. I'm sure a lot of you saw the meltdown in Afghanistan in August. And what were some of the emotions that were going through your mind as you watched this situation unfold, the Afghan government collapsing, the Taliban riding into Kabul and other cities to take over, tens of thousands of Afghans coming to the airport trying to get out? What are some of the emotions that you felt as you watched this unfold? Yes, sir.
What a disservice to all the American and NATO members who have given their lives and have been injured in the fight. To see this be the culmination.
So, disappointment, anger, disgust, grief, yeah, of course.
No one was feeling it, but practical.
Okay, so a relief as well. For some, I felt all of those emotions. Anger at seeing this enterprise that we built for 20 years at a cost of $2 trillion US taxpayer dollars, over 2,300 service members killed in action, to include 6 of my own soldiers killed in action. Tens of thousands wounded, and those are just with physical wounds, not to mention the tens of thousands with wounds unseen. And just to see it all collapse like a barn built on toothpicks. I was very angry. I spent 4 years on the ground there as well, a lot of personal time and energy. I also felt disgust. Disgust at senior Afghan officials just simply taking the money and running. Commanders abandoning their soldiers in the field. And deep disappointment that we went through this conflict for 20 years. And other conflicts like it, Vietnam, Iraq, and some of the smaller interventions, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Syria. The list goes on. We seem to have the reverse Midas touch, where every time we get into these interventions, they turn into fiascos. And yet, despite the trillions of dollars we've invested in the human cost, not a single presidential candidate from either party had anything to say about national security reform in the 2020 election. Nobody's talking about it. There's no accountability for these interventions that continue turning into disasters. And so I felt all of those emotions, and they're part of the reason why I wrote Zero-Sum Victory, What We're Getting Wrong About War. What we saw in August was kind of like the military equivalent of the 2008 financial crisis, where a lot of low and moderate probability events sort of all strung together to create this disaster that really nobody foresaw. And there are 3 main reasons that I'd like to focus on for why that disaster happened, and then of course talk about what we do about it. I'm getting a little bit of, see if that helps. Okay, a little bit too loud. 3 main reasons. The first one is complacency. Einstein said that a definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Well, complacency is to do the same thing over and over again and expect the same results. Because when you're doing the same thing over and over again, but your adversary is innovating, then you're falling further and further behind. And we got very complacent, and so did the Afghan government. The Afghan government never bothered, at no point in the 20-year history, did they bother to gain the buy-in of the Afghan people. And as you know, from work, from living, from when people have buy-in, they invest their discretionary effort. They're going to stand by you when the going gets tough. When there's no buy-in, then people are going to vote with their feet at the first sign of difficulty. And what we saw in August was the Afghan people voting with their feet. Afghan soldiers voting with their feet to accept the Taliban as the lesser of 2 evils. The Afghan government, since about 2006, had self-organized into a kleptocracy. Now, kleptocracy is more than just people taking bribes. Kleptocracy is, from the Greek, government of thieves. And that's what the Afghan government had become, where many Afghan governmental positions were for sale. If you wanted to be a one-star general in the Afghan military, you might pay $100,000 or more for that position. If you wanted to be a police chief or a governor for a tier 1 province, one of the big provinces, then you might pay 2 to 3 million US dollars. A friend of mine who was in the Afghan Ministry of Interior told me that there was, in Helmand, one of the most violent provinces of Afghanistan, there was a queue, a line of people stacked up waiting to be the police chief of the province. And so they had to work through them so fast they could only keep police chiefs for like 6 months at a time. And they'd all pay their few millions of dollars, and they'd all participate in the opium trade. So this money, these positions for sale, the money is not the sort of a donation to the public good, right? This is a down payment to use your position to make back that money and turn a profit. So the way the system would work is you would pay, or a group of people who sponsored you would pay that amount of money, and to people close to the presidential palace or some of the warlords. And if you got the position, then you use that position for to pay everybody back. And there were some tried and true ways that you use your position to make that money back. One is extorting international aid and development dollars. I mean, people were charging 40, 50, 70% of our contracts. So a provincial governor would write on a contract, 70. That meant 70% of that road, that school, that whatever, went into the pocket of the governor. So if you had a $100,000 school, just to make the math easy, and they charged a 70% tax, that's $70,000 going into the hands of the governor. So you've got $30,000 left to build a $100,000 school. Well, and then this project would get subcontracted a few times. So by the time it gets to the poor person who actually has to try to build the school, maybe they've got $10,000, maybe $20,000. And so what do? Well, they don't hire enough people. They dilute the cement mixtures. They use rotten wood that they've dragged out of the river. I've seen all of this happen. And that's why you get $100,000 schools that collapse, in the first tremor. And unfortunately, sometimes kill Afghan kids. So extortion of our international aid and development dollars was part of it. Of course, participation in the black market, opium, trade, gems, timber, etc., all a way of making the money back. Commanders and police chiefs would often sell fuel, sell their soldiers food, sell their soldiers ammunition on the black market, put their soldiers in pickup trucks in heavy IED areas so they could steal the fuel that was set aside for the big gas-guzzling, mine-resistant, armored, protective vehicles, the big MRAPs, the ginormous things. Those are gas guzzlers. So if you could keep your MRAPs deadlined, not operational, and put everybody into pickup trucks, which are far more fuel efficient, you can sell all of that fuel on the black market. And it's no wonder why soldiers said, hey, if this person's going to sell me out like this, then I'm not going to stand my ground anymore. They would also, ghost soldiers, one of my personal favorites, ghost soldiers. So a ghost soldier is a person whose name is on the rolls, who is collecting where salary is going to this person, but they don't physically exist. So by the time of the collapse, there's some estimates that say 2/3 of the Afghan military were ghost soldiers. And so commanders would be able to collect the salaries of these soldiers put them in the pockets. And so something that looked like 300,000 people on paper was really 200,000 fictitious individuals and 100,000 real people. They would engage in land theft, kicking people off their land and then selling the land. Kidnapping for ransom. Oh, your uncle's in jail. I'm sure you can get him out for about $100,000. And then another one of my personal favorites is providing false intelligence to US forces, saying, she's Taliban, he's Al-Qaeda. And we get enough people saying the same thing, suddenly it becomes actionable intelligence, and we are paying them visits in the middle of the night. And of course, this causes civilian casualties. And all of these actions, these predatory actions by Afghan officials, and in many ways, us being duped into those and causing civilian casualties of our own, these actions pushed Afghans into the arms of the Taliban and other insurgent groups who were killing our soldiers. The second big reason is we weren't very good partners, which is shocking to say when we ponied up $2 trillion in taxpayer money and spent 20 years. But we weren't very good partners. And the biggest issue with our partnership is that we did not help the Afghan military and government be the best version of itself. We tried to create them into mini-me's of us. Now, some of this was at the urging of Afghan officials who would look at our forces and say, I want our forces to be like that. And we would say, well, the Afghans have spoken, therefore we're gonna do this. But a lot of it was just simply mirror imaging, that we didn't know any different. I mean, we really don't have a doctrine for how you create a military force that looks like a military force other than our own. And so people are just doing their best trying to do what they do. But what it did was it created a government and a security force of such massive dependency that when it became apparent that that was going away, and part of the Afghan government's complacency was that they never thought we were going to leave. When it became apparent that that was going away, the whole thing collapsed overnight. Now, I'm a consultant. I work for small businesses. And my job is to help leaders be the best version of themselves. And when we part ways, which inevitably we do, I want my clients to soar to new heights and not crash and burn. In fact, it would be unethical for me as a consultant to create such dependency on my clients that when we left, they crashed and burned. And yet this is exactly what we did with the Afghan military and government. Created such dependency that they did not feel the confidence or the capability to stand on their own. This is strategic malpractice, and it needs to stop. The third sort of proximate cause is the Taliban were just simply more innovative than either we were or the Afghan government was. When you look at, I mean, this is a ragtag group of militants who by our standards would be uneducated, but they were much more innovative than we were. Militarily, we're more innovative. Politically innovative, so they were able to convince Afghans that they weren't the crazy uncles of the 1990s, that this was a sort of Taliban 2.0 enough, and then they would follow through in the areas that they controlled enough so that people said, they're the lesser of two evils. Diplomatically, the Taliban have been more innovative. They've been on an outreach campaign since at least 2010, reaching out to us and other members of the international community saying, look, we can be viable partners as in Afghanistan. And so in all of those different levels, they were, while we were staying the same, straight line, they're innovating. And the gap grew so far over time that people voted with their feet for the Taliban. Now, of course, this disaster, the seeds were sown for this disaster many years before August of 2000 or 2021 took place. So we get into these conflicts, we generally know where we're starting. Afghanistan, we were attacked on September 11th, 2001 by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda operatives, and Al-Qaeda operatives, their central headquarters is in Afghanistan. We got that. We kind of know what success looks like. In the case of Afghanistan, it's Afghanistan at peace with itself and its neighbors, not a safe haven for international terrorists to execute attacks on the United States and its allies, and to follow the basic convention of the international human rights. I mean, that never really changed over 20 years. We also have a pretty good idea of what failure looks like, which in this case was just the opposite of success. The challenge, though, of course, is what is in between. And this is what Clausewitz would call the fog of war. The chaos, the complexity, the uncertainty of how do you get from where you are now to where you want to be. And so what we would do is we would backward plan, start with, okay, what does success look like? And then what are the key ingredients to get there? And we would create these plans that included milestones, various milestones. And the thought was, if we can string together enough of these milestones and make them all happen, then it will lead to a decisive victory. So those milestones might look like choosing an interim government, writing a constitution, having elections, building a security force, creating an economic plan. Those are all examples of milestones. And so we'd have the milestones, and then we go into the conflict with a very military-centric plan, thinking that if we go in heavy with the military and meet all these milestones, that we'll achieve a decisive victory. The enemy will surrender, we'll get everything we want, the adversary will get nothing. But once we enter an environment, all the actors in that environment adapt. So you have a lot of different actors, of course. You've got the people, you've got the host nation government, you have got insurgents or violent opposition, you've got allies, you've got neighbors, and as they react and adapt, two critical factors form, which become a strategic pivot. And those two critical factors, I'm going to draw this out so just to make it easier to see. Those two critical factors are insurgent sustainability and host nation government legitimacy. According to longitudinal studies by Rand and others, an insurgency that has had external sanctuary and enough indigenous support to field a team has been successful every single time since the Second World War. Doesn't mean they won a decisive victory, but it means that they were not decisively defeated. They achieved a lot of their aims. By contrast, a host nation government that has not won the battle of legitimacy in the eyes of its population has been unsuccessful every single time since the Second World War, at least, probably before that. So, and one way to look at battle of legitimacy is, can the host nation government take and retain territory that's either contested or under the control of the insurgency? And so, if one of those two variables are in the wrong direction, then the probability of achieving a decisive victory is zero. And your best alternative at that point is to negotiate. So, insurgent sustainability across the top, and host nation legitimacy on the side. And you could just do a simple yes, no. The only scenario in which you have the chance to achieve a decisive military victory is if the host nation government is considered legitimate and the insurgency is not sustainable. Then you can get a decisive victory. Otherwise, you're not, and if you try to, you're just going to get stuck. But if we don't recognize those pivot points, these critical factors, we're not measuring, if we're not validating our assumptions, then chances are we are going to drift, which is exactly what we do. We tend to drift towards failure. But due to things like confirmation bias, status quo bias, a lot of these cognitive biases that you know about, while we are drifting downwards, we're still hitting the milestones. So we believe that we are up here. And you hear US officials all the time talking about the great progress, that we are on track to succeed in Afghanistan. And meanwhile, the rest of us are looking at the whole situation going, this place is going to hell in a handbasket. What do they mean they're making progress? But this is what's going on. This is the gap that I'm talking about. They believe they're up here when really they're drifting downwards. They also drift downwards, and this downward slide is very difficult to reverse because of bureaucratic silos. Gillian Tett's got a great book called The Silo Effect, in which she discusses the importance of silos on the 2008 financial crisis. We have the same thing here. The US government, I call it America's bureaucratic way of war. We deploy to these theaters in silos, and there's nobody in charge on the ground of US efforts. There's nobody in charge of our wars. Functionally, there's nobody in charge of our wars. And so everybody does their own thing within their silo. And that's why the military can say, Mr. President, we're making great progress. Look at all of the security forces we've trained and all of the enemy that we've killed or captured. And the embassy can say, we're making great progress. Look at all of the civil servants we've trained, how many conferences we've arranged. The aid people can say, we're making great progress, et cetera, and so forth. And they believe it, but what they're not seeing is the downward drift. And then finally, there is the what I'll call frictions or principal agent problems in the academic literature between us and the host nation government. And so all of these create this downward drift and make it very difficult to change. And once these challenges, cognitive bias, silos, frictions, once they take on a hypnotic rhythm, you're done. You're drifting towards failure. So if this is time, as you know, the longer you drift, the harder it is to change. And at some point, that drift becomes irreversible. And so in Afghanistan, when President Obama announced a surge and a withdrawal, is probably when things became irreversible. And so we wind up getting stuck. We're not able to get back up to success. And then we wind up either staying there forever or leaving and things collapse go to hell in a handbasket. So in a nutshell, you could scratch out Afghanistan, you could put Vietnam. You could scratch out Vietnam and you could put Iraq, and it's the same story. Okay, so what do we do about it? I think there are three things that are feasible to do that will help reduce the risk of these quagmires. So there's no panacea here. but they'll at least reduce the risk of these quagmires. The first one is, we as a US government do not have a war waging doctrine. Wait a minute, the military's got all sorts of doctrine. Of course it does. The military does war fighting. A government does war waging. So we've got a war fighting doctrine that governs how the military performs its normal functions against an adversary. What we don't have is a war waging doctrine for how the US government as a whole communicates with itself, sets priorities, makes decisions. No common set of terms and concepts for things like defeat or war termination, which I write about in Zero-Sum Victory. And the result is that we're constantly talking past one another in these meetings. And so it impedes coordination, it impedes effective decision-making, and it creates this huge status quo bias that becomes very, very difficult to change. Second is we need to begin bridging these silos, and we need to get somebody in charge of our wars on the ground. So the way that we do things now is we have President of the United States, the National Security Council, so Secretary of State, Defense, and a lot of these engagements, you'll have aid, you'll have the intel communities, et cetera. And when we deploy into a combat zone, let's say Afghanistan, each bureaucracy deploys forces and capabilities within their respective silos. And so on the ground, you have the embassy. Within defense, you may have like a 4-star headquarters. Sometimes these special operations forces are operating of their own accord, not under the 4-star headquarters. You may have different flavors of military, all reporting up their separate chains of command. You have your aid workers reporting up to USAID. You've got your various shapes of intel communities, all deploying within their silos. But there's nobody in charge on the ground. Imagine being the Ford Motor Company, for instance. You've got plants all over the world. But you decide, I'm not going to have any plant managers. Instead, you're going to have the chief of operations at each plant report to the chief of operations in Detroit. And you're going to have your human resources person at each plant report directly to the human resources counterpart in Detroit. And the same with logistics and IT, et cetera. You can't run a business that way. And we're not running wars effectively this way either, because the whole is always less than the sum of its parts. What we need to do is bridge these silos, and one way to do that is this. Oh, by the way, there's nobody. In this scenario, there is nobody the President of the United States can hold accountable for results, for achieving US war aims. General so-and-so, why aren't things going very well in Afghanistan? Well, Mr. President, I don't know, but I do know that we're making great progress. Look at how many Afghan security forces we've trained. Look at how many Taliban we've killed or captured. Ambassador, why aren't things going so well in Afghanistan? Oh, Mr. President, we're making great progress. And I mean, that's what we saw for 20 years. So when you have a situation in business and national security in which everybody's making great progress, but things are getting worse, you probably have a silo problem. So a way to bridge those silos is to actually put somebody in charge, to put a CEO in the plant and these different plants across the world. So in this scenario, you've got the National Security Council advising the president. And what the president does is selects a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed commander on the ground. This could be civilian, it could be military. So let's say this is in Afghanistan, and that person is in charge of delivering U.S. war aims. And everybody works for that individual. So, the folks at the embassy, the folks in the military, aid, intel, et cetera, all works for that person who reports to the president and is held accountable by the president for achieving our war aims. The third thing that we can do is we need to stop getting jerked around by corrupt partners. There's a lot of good work in the academic world about principal agent challenges and how you change incentive structures. And the US government has not been benefiting from any of it. So when you look at how all the mirror imaging that we do with our security forces, when you look at, everybody knew that Afghanistan corruption was a problem, but it was really difficult for people to understand how the kleptocracy worked and why it was so toxic. And every time there would be the start of an effort to try to address it, we would either lose political will or we just didn't know. We didn't know how do you prevent a kleptocracy from forming? What are the indications that it's beginning, and then what are the incentives that you can work with to try to prevent it from happening? Because once it becomes a hypnotic habit, you're not going to change it. Too many people invested too much skin in the game. So we need to have a better way of working with our partners on the ground to create the right incentives and to create the right penalties when that's necessary. Otherwise, we just get associated with all of the worst actors. And when you look at it, most well-governed places don't have insurgencies. And when we're partnered with a host nation government fighting an insurgency, chances are they are not a well-governing institution. And so we get associated with them, and it damages our credibility. So those are three feasible ways that we can at least reduce the risk of these fiascos happening in the future.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.